He was just following a creek, no map, no plan, no idea what he'd find. But deep in the woods, he stumbled upon a forgotten cabin, hidden from the world for decades. What was inside wasn't treasure, it wasn't money. But what he discovered there changed everything he believed about loss, regret, and second chances. Subscribe for more powerful stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Walter Hayes was 64 years old when the quiet finally became unbearable. He lived alone in a weathered house outside a fading mountain town in northern Oregon, a place where mornings came slow and conversations were rare. His wife had passed years ago, and his grown children lived lives too busy to include more than the occasional phone call. Walter didn't resent them, but the silence between those calls lingered longer than he liked to admit. On that particular morning, he laced up his worn boots and headed toward the creek that wound through the forest beyond town. He had walked that path countless times in his younger years, back when his body felt stronger and his future felt certain. The creek still moved with the same quiet determination, water sliding over stone as if nothing else in the world had changed. Without realizing it, Walter followed the stream farther than usual. The forest grew denser. The familiar trail faded beneath fallen leaves. Then he saw it. A forgotten cabin stood ahead, half collapsed and cloaked in moss, as though the woods had been slowly reclaiming it for decades. One window was shattered. The roof sagged under the weight of time. Yet something about the place pulled at him steady, undeniable. Walter stood still, listening to the water rush past, sensing that this forgotten cabin wasn't just abandoned wood and stone, it was an invitation. And for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost forever purpose. Walter Hayes didn't plan to go inside the cabin that day. At first, he only circled it, stepping carefully over roots and damp leaves, studying the way the structure leaned slightly toward the creek as if it had grown tired of standing on its own. The air smelled of wet wood and pine sap. Somewhere above him, a bird startled and took flight. The cabin felt watched, not in a threatening way, but in the way old places sometimes do, like they remember more than they reveal. Walter rested a hand against one of the exterior logs. The wood was rough, splintered, but solid beneath the rot. That surprised him. He pressed harder, still firm. The place wasn't dead, not yet. He told himself he'd only look through the window. But when he reached the front door, he noticed it wasn't locked. The handle sagged, rusted and cold. He hesitated, a strange tightness forming in his chest. For reasons he didn't understand, stepping inside felt heavier than it should have, like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Walter thought of his wife then. Margaret had always been the brave one, the kind who took wrong turns on purpose just to see where they led. You don't find anything new by staying comfortable, she used to say. He could almost hear her voice now, clear and certain, nudging him forward. He turned the handle. The door creaked open with a long, aching groan, releasing a breath of cold, stale air. Dust swirled in the pale light slipping through the broken window. Inside, the cabin was smaller than he expected. One main room. A stone fireplace collapsed on one side, and a narrow table pushed against the far wall. But it wasn't empty. A chair sat near the fireplace, its legs uneven, as if someone had dragged it there long ago and never moved it back. On the table lay a tin cup, tipped on its side, and beside it a notebook. Walter's heart skipped. He stepped closer, each movement slow, deliberate, as though the cabin might vanish if he moved too quickly. The notebook's cover was cracked and warped from moisture, but it was unmistakably handwritten. Someone had been here. someone had lived here. Walter picked it up with care. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle at the edges. He flipped to the first page and read the opening line. "If you're reading this, I probably didn't leave the way I planned." Walter swallowed. The handwriting was neat but heavy, the kind written by a man who thought before every word. The entries spoke of isolation, of choosing the woods over the noise of the world, of mistakes made, bridges burned, and the quiet hope that solitude might offer redemption. Walter sank slowly into the chair. Each page felt uncomfortably familiar. The writer spoke about regret, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the slow regret of years passing without repair, of people lost not to death, but to silence. Walter felt his chest tighten. He thought of unanswered letters, of conversations postponed until later, of how many times he'd chosen distance over discomfort, only to wake up one day surrounded by neither conflict nor connection, just emptiness. He closed the notebook and stared at the wall. For years, Walter had told himself he was fine, that solitude was peace, that grief was something you learned to live around, like old furniture you never bothered to move. But sitting there, in a cabin abandoned by another man who had once believed the same things, Walter felt something crack open. This cabin wasn't just forgotten, it was a warning. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. His breath came faster now. He should leave. That was the sensible thing. Go back to town, back to routine, back to the life he knew how to endure. Instead, he walked to the broken window and looked out at the creek. The water moved forward without hesitation, flowing around rocks, fallen branches, whatever stood in its way. It didn't stop. It didn't cling to what it had already passed. Walter rested his forehead against the cool glass frame. For the first time in years, he asked himself a question he'd been avoiding. Is this really how I want the rest of my life to look? He looked back at the notebook on the table, at the chair, at the quiet. Something shifted then, not loudly, not all at once, but deeply. Walter realized he hadn't followed the creek by accident, and he hadn't found this cabin by chance. This place was offering him something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a very long time, the possibility that it wasn't too late to choose differently. He took the notebook with him when he left the cabin that day, not to keep it forever, but as a reminder, as Walter stepped back into the forest. The light filtering through the trees seemed brighter somehow. The air felt sharper, cleaner. He didn't know yet what this cabin would mean to him. He didn't know if he'd return tomorrow, or ever. But one thing was clear. The quiet he'd been living in was no longer enough, and whatever waited inside that forgotten cabin had already begun to change him. Walter Hayes returned to the cabin 3 days later. He told himself it was just curiosity, that the notebook had unsettled him, and he needed closure. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. Something had been left unfinished between him and that forgotten place, and the thought of it gnawed at him in the quiet hours before dawn. This time, he came prepared. A flashlight, gloves, a thermos of coffee. The forest felt different as he followed the creek again, less distant, more aware. The water murmured steadily beside him, as if it recognized his return. The cabin appeared just as before, hunched and silent. But as Walter stepped inside, the air felt heavier, colder. He set his flashlight on the table and began to explore more carefully than he had the first time. Behind the collapsed fireplace, he noticed something he'd missed: a narrow door, half hidden by fallen stone and soot-blackened wood. It wasn't on the cabin's original plans. That much was clear. Walter knelt and pulled away debris until the door gave way with a dull crack. A rush of colder air spilled out, carrying the smell of damp earth. A cellar, The steps were steep and uneven, carved crudely into the dirt. Walter hesitated at the top. Every sensible instinct told him to stop, to leave well enough alone. But the notebook's words echoed in his mind. I probably didn't leave the way I planned. He descended slowly. The cellar was small, barely tall enough to stand upright. The flashlight beam cut through darkness, revealing shelves carved into the walls. Most were empty, but in the far corner sat a wooden chest, its surface scarred and warped. Walter's pulse quickened. He knelt again, brushing away dust. The latch resisted, then snapped open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, carefully bundled with twine. Names written in faded ink across envelopes, dates stretching back nearly 40 years. Walter picked one up at random. It wasn't addressed to anyone he recognized. But as he read, his breath caught. The letter wasn't a goodbye. It was an apology. The writer spoke of leaving a family behind, of fear masquerading as freedom, of believing solitude would erase guilt instead of amplifying it. Each word felt heavy, deliberate, written by someone who knew he was running out of time. Walter read another, and another. Then his hands began to shake, because the final bundle was different. The handwriting was shakier, the ink uneven, and the name on the envelope was unmistakable. Margaret Hayes. Walter froze. His wife's name stared back at him from a place that should have had no connection to his life at all. His mouth went dry. His heart hammered painfully against his ribs. Slowly, carefully, he opened the letter. It was dated 32 years ago, before they were married, before he'd known her. The words inside were not romantic. They were raw, confessional. Margaret wrote about a man she'd loved once, someone who had disappeared without explanation. She wrote about unanswered questions, about choosing to move forward not because she'd healed, but because she had no other choice. The signature at the bottom was hers. Walter sat back against the cellar wall, the flashlight rolling from his hand. The man who had lived in this cabin, the one who had written the notebook, the apologies, the regrets, had known his wife. Not casually, deeply. The realization hit him with stunning force. This cabin wasn't just a mirror, it was a collision of pasts. Walter felt anger rise first, then confusion, then something quieter, more painful understanding. He saw now how grief twisted people into making choices they believed they could survive. He saw how silence could ripple across decades, touching lives that never expected to intersect. He stayed in the cellar for a long time, long after his coffee had gone cold. When he finally climbed back into the cabin, the forest outside was still. Snowmelt dripped slowly from branches. Time moved forward, indifferent to revelation. Walter gathered the letters carefully and placed them back in the chest. Some truths weren't meant to be carried away. Some were meant to be honored where they rested. As he stood to leave, a sharp pain shot through his leg. He stumbled. His foot slipped on loose stone near the cellar entrance, and he fell hard against the wall. Pain exploded through his hip and shoulder. The flashlight clattered away, plunging the cabin into shadow. Walter gasped, breath ragged. He tried to stand. His leg refused. For the first time since his wife's death, real fear set in, not emotional, but physical, the kind that reminds you how fragile the body becomes with age. Alone, injured. In a forgotten cabin deep in the woods, Walter lay there, staring at the ceiling beams, heart racing. Then he laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was honest. Life, it seemed, wasn't finished testing him. But neither was he finished responding. He reached for the doorframe and pulled himself upright, inch by inch, pain screaming through his body. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach the door. Another 10 to step back into the cold daylight. Walter leaned heavily on a tree, breathing hard. He looked once more at the cabin. This place had given him more than memories. It had given him truth, and truth, he realized, demands action. As he limped back toward the creek, Walter knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wasn't done with this cabin yet, and whatever came next would require more courage than simply remembering. Walter Hayes didn't return to the cabin for over a week. The fall had left his hip bruised and his pride worse for wear, but the real reason was quieter, heavier. The discovery in the cellar followed him home, lingering in the corners of his thoughts, surfacing in the still moments before sleep. Margaret's name, her handwriting, a chapter of her life he had never known and one she had never spoken of. For years, Walter had believed grief was about what you lost. Now he understood it was also about what you never learned. He spent long mornings sitting at his kitchen table, coffee cooling untouched, staring out the window at the bare trees. He replayed his marriage in fragments, the laughter, the arguments, the silences. He wondered how many words Margaret had swallowed, how many truths she had decided were better left buried. And he wondered how many he had done the same. Walter had always thought of himself as steady, dependable, the kind of man who stayed, but staying, he realized, wasn't the same as opening up. He had been present, yes, but guarded. He had avoided difficult conversations not out of cruelty, but out of fear of stirring pain, fear of what might change if things were said out loud. The man in the cabin had made the opposite choice. He had run from discomfort straight into isolation, believing distance could erase regret. And yet his words, written decades later, proved the opposite. Regret had only grown louder in the quiet. Walter saw it clearly now. 2 men, 2 paths, same mistake. One chose silence within connection. The other chose solitude without resolution. Both paid a price. That understanding softened something inside Walter, not anger, not blame, but compassion. For the man who had written those letters, for Margaret, who had carried unanswered questions into a new life, and finally, for himself. When Walter returned to the cabin, he did so slowly, leaning on a walking stick he'd carved from fallen alder. The creek greeted him with the same steady sound, unchanged, patient. Inside, the cabin felt less ominous than before. The air was still cold, the floor still uneven, but the fear was gone. What remained was honesty. Walter sat in the old chair and allowed himself to speak aloud for the first time. "I didn't know," he said softly. "But maybe I should have asked more." The words echoed faintly, then faded. He didn't open the cellar again. He didn't touch the letters. Some stories didn't need to be relived to be respected. They had already done their work. Instead, Walter walked the perimeter of the cabin, studying it with new eyes. He noticed the way the roof sagged not irreparably, but enough to need care. He saw gaps between the logs where wind slipped through. Damage, yes, but also potential. And something else became clear. This cabin had never been meant as an escape. It was a place to confront what had been avoided. Walter thought about how many years he had left, not in fear, but in honesty. He wasn't young. His body reminded him of that daily, but he wasn't finished either. There were conversations he could still have, letters he could still write, truths he could still say if not to others, then at least to himself. He returned home that evening and did something he hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. He wrote, not a letter to the past, but one to his children. Not dramatic, not confessional, just honest. He told them he loved them. Yes, but also that he wished he had said more over the years. That he hoped they would never confuse silence with strength. He didn't ask for anything in return. He simply sent it. Back at the cabin, days later, Walter brought tools. Nothing ambitious, just small repairs. He cleared debris, reset a loose stone near the fireplace, patched one narrow gap with scrap wood and patience. Each small act felt grounding. Not like fixing a structure, but like restoring balance. Walter understood now that perspective doesn't always arrive as a revelation. Sometimes it comes as a quiet decision to live differently going forward. He sat by the creek as the afternoon light softened, listening to water move steadily onward. The past, he realized, wasn't a weight meant to be carried forever. It was a teacher, and the lesson was simple, though not easy. It's never too late to stop running from others, or from yourself. As Walter stood and turned back toward the cabin, he no longer saw it as abandoned or forgotten. He saw it as a second chance, not to rewrite the past, but to finally live fully in what remained. Walter Hayes didn't intend for the cabin to become part of his routine. At first, it was just a place he visited when the days felt too long and the house too empty. A place where the creek's steady movement reminded him that time could pass without demanding anything from him. But as the weeks went on, his visits grew more deliberate. He brought tools, extra gloves, a small thermos of soup instead of just coffee. And without ever making a formal decision, Walter began to care for the cabin. He repaired what he could not with urgency, but with patience. He reinforced a loose beam near the entrance. He replaced rotting boards on the porch, one at a time, stopping often to rest his hip. The work was slow, but it suited him. At this stage in life, Walter wasn't interested in speed. He was interested in doing things right. One afternoon, while clearing brush near the creek, he noticed something unexpected. Footprints. Not old ones, fresh. Walter straightened slowly, scanning the tree line. He felt a flicker of unease, quickly followed by curiosity. The cabin hadn't seen visitors in years, at least not ones who stayed. The next day, he found the answer. A man stood near the creek, younger than Walter by at least 20 years, studying the water with a fishing rod in hand. When he noticed Walter, he looked startled, then embarrassed. "I didn't realize anyone owned this place," the man said. "I hope I'm not trespassing." Walter surprised himself by smiling. "It's all right," he replied. "Most people don't even know this cabin exists." The man introduced himself as Evan Miller. Recently moved to town after a difficult divorce. Fishing, he explained, was the only thing that quieted his thoughts. They spoke for a few minutes, nothing heavy, nothing personal. Just two men standing near water, acknowledging each other's presence. But as Evan turned to leave, he paused. "Your repairs," he said, nodding toward the cabin. "They're solid. You do this kind of work." Walter hesitated. He hadn't thought of it that way. "I used to," he said finally, "a long time ago." That night, Walter sat alone in the cabin, the question lingering. He thought back to his younger years, how he'd worked with his hands before. Office jobs and obligations pulled him away. How building something tangible had once given him a sense of clarity he hadn't realized he'd lost. The cabin, he realized, wasn't just giving him peace. It was reminding him of who he'd been before grief narrowed his world. Over the next few weeks, word traveled quietly. Evan mentioned the repairs to someone else. A hiker stopped by one afternoon to ask if the cabin was abandoned. A woman walking her dog asked if Walter could help fix a broken step on her porch. Walter said yes, not because he needed the money, but because he needed the motion, the interaction, the sense that his time still had value beyond passing hours. He kept the work modest, nothing that strained his body too much, nothing rushed, and people respected that. They trusted him. One morning, a handwritten note appeared wedged beneath the cabin door. Town council meeting Thursday night. Could use your input on trail restoration near the creek. Walter read it twice. For years, he had avoided meetings, avoided committees, avoided anything that asked him to speak in public. But this was different. This wasn't about opinions or politics. It was about stewardship, about caring for something that had quietly supported generations. Walter attended the meeting. He didn't say much, just pointed out erosion risks near the creek, suggested small repairs instead of large disruptions, spoke from experience rather than authority. People listened. Afterward, a woman from the council thanked him. "We could use someone like you," she said. "Someone who understands the land." Walter walked home that night feeling lighter than he had in years. Not because life had suddenly become exciting, but because it had become meaningful again. The cabin transformed slowly. Not into something modern or impressive, but into something intentional. A place where Walter could sit, work, and think. Where others occasionally stopped by. Where conversations happened naturally, without pressure. Walter realized something profound in those quiet months. Opportunity doesn't always arrive as a dramatic offer or a life-changing event. Sometimes it arrives disguised as usefulness, as being needed not desperately, but genuinely. And that was enough. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the sun lower through the trees, Walter rested a hand on the cabin wall. This place had once held someone who ran from his past. Now, it held a man who was finally willing to stand still and build forward. The creek continued to flow, and for the first time in a long while, Walter felt certain he was moving with it, not against it. Walter Hayes began to feel stronger, not younger, but steadier. His body still ached in the mornings, his hip reminding him of the fall with a dull protest every time he stood too fast. But his hands moved with purpose again. His mind felt clearer. Days had shape, meaning. The cabin was no longer just a place he visited, it was part of his rhythm. Then, one afternoon, something happened that unsettled that balance. Walter was repairing a section of the interior wall when he heard footsteps outside, not the casual pace of a hiker. These were deliberate, heavy, unfamiliar. He stepped onto the porch. A truck sat near the tree line, engine still ticking as it cooled. Standing beside it was a man in his late 40s, dressed too neatly for the woods, eyes fixed on the cabin with an expression Walter couldn't immediately read. "You must be Walter Hayes," the man said. Walter nodded slowly. "That's right." The man exhaled, as if bracing himself. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I've been looking for this place for a long time." Something in his voice tightened Walter's chest. Daniel stepped closer, careful, almost respectful. "This cabin, it belonged to my father." The words landed heavier than Walter expected. "The man who lived here," Daniel continued, "he disappeared when I was 16. One day he just left. No goodbye, no explanation. We never found him." Walter felt the ground shift beneath him. Daniel's eyes moved over the repairs, the cleared land, the rebuilt porch. I followed old maps, stories, a creek he used to talk about. I wasn't sure this place was even real anymore. Walter swallowed. He thought of the notebook, the letters, the apologies never sent. He wrote, Walter said quietly, "A lot." Daniel's breath caught. Then he stayed. Walter nodded, yes. They sat inside the cabin for a long time after that. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with shared understanding. Walter didn't offer the letters. He didn't need to. Daniel already knew what they would say. "My father wasn't a bad man," Daniel said eventually, "just a scared one." Walter looked at him. "So was I once." Daniel studied Walter carefully. "Then why didn't you run?" The question surprised him. Walter considered it. "I did," he said honestly, "just not with my feet." Daniel smiled faintly. "I wish he'd stayed long enough to realize that." Before leaving, Daniel walked the cabin one last time. At the door, he turned back. "I don't want it," he said. "I don't want to erase him either. I just wanted to know where he ended up." He hesitated. "You gave this place a second life. That matters." After the truck disappeared down the trail, Walter sat alone, shaken in a way he hadn't expected. That night he dreamed, not of Margaret, but of conversations never finished. Fathers and sons, husbands and wives, words hovering just out of reach. The next morning, Walter made a decision. He took the notebook from where it had been hidden and read it again, this time not as a mirror, but as a responsibility. The man who had lived here had failed to finish his story. Walter wouldn't make the same mistake. He began to change how he spoke to people. He called his son not just to check in, but to listen. Really listen. He apologized for absences that had seemed small at the time. He told his daughter he was proud of her without waiting for the right moment. And then came another surprise. Late one evening, as Walter locked up the cabin, he noticed a light near the creek, a small fire. Voices. A group of teenagers, local kids, had wandered off the trail and built a campfire too close to dry brush. Dangerous? Careless? Old Walter might have walked away. This Walter didn't. He approached calmly, corrected them firmly, showed them how quickly fire could spread near the waterline. He didn't lecture. He explained. They listened. One of them asked, "Did you build this place?" Walter shook his head. "No, but I learned from it." They put out the fire properly and thanked him awkwardly, yogues, but sincerely. As they left, one boy turned back. "You should teach people," he said. "You're good at explaining things." Walter stood there long after they were gone. Teach? The word followed him home. He realized then how much he had grown, not in strength, but in courage. Courage to speak, to intervene, to connect, to stay present even when it would be easier to retreat. The cabin had tested him. The past had confronted him. And instead of retreating into silence, Walter had stepped forward. He wasn't just repairing wood and stone anymore. He was repairing the way he lived. As the creek flowed steadily in the fading light, Walter understood something deeply unsettling and deeply hopeful. Growth doesn't announce itself. It sneaks up on you, and by the time you notice it, you're already becoming someone braver than you were before. Walter Hayes didn't realize when the cabin stopped being a project and started becoming a promise. It happened gradually, in the way the best changes always do. One morning, he woke before dawn and noticed he wasn't dreading the day ahead. Another afternoon, he caught himself humming while repairing a loose hinge. Small things, easy to overlook, impossible to deny. The cabin stood differently now. Not taller, not newer, but steadier. The roof no longer sagged. The porch no longer creaked under cautious steps. Smoke rose gently from the chimney on cool evenings, visible from the creek like a quiet signal that someone was still here, still trying. So was Walter. On a crisp autumn morning, he followed the creek as he always did, stopping at the bend where the water widened and slowed. Sunlight filtered through the trees. scattering gold across the surface. He stood there longer than usual, hands resting on his walking stick, breathing deeply. For the first time since Margaret's passing, the memories didn't crush him. They warmed him. He thought about her laughter, her stubborn optimism, the way she believed life was meant to be engaged, not endured. For years, he had mistaken survival for living. Now he understood the difference. That afternoon, Walter hosted something he never would have imagined a year earlier. People. Nothing formal, just coffee, a small fire, and open space. Evan came by with fishing stories. Daniel returned, quieter this time. Standing longer near the creek, a woman from town brought homemade bread. Even a few of the teenagers showed up, curious and awkward, unsure if they belonged. Walter welcomed them anyway. They sat on logs and mismatched chairs, sharing stories that wandered from the trivial to the deeply personal. No one rushed, no one pretended. The cabin absorbed it all, the laughter, the pauses, the silences that no longer felt empty. As dusk settled in, someone asked Walter a simple question. "Why did you keep this place?" Walter looked around before answering. He thought about the man who had hidden here, hoping solitude would erase his pain. He thought about Margaret's letters, never meant to be found. He thought about the years he himself had lived quietly, waiting for something to change without ever reaching for it. "I didn't keep it," Walter said slowly. "It kept me." The words surprised him with their truth. This forgotten cabin had given him more than shelter. It had given him perspective. It had forced him to face silence instead of hiding inside it. It had reminded him that being older didn't mean being finished. When the fire burned low and people began to drift away, Walter remained on the porch alone. The forest settled into its nighttime rhythm. The creek continued its steady song. He felt tired, but it was a good tired, the kind that comes from engagement, not avoidance. Walter realized something then that he wished he'd known sooner. Life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It keeps moving, like the creek, asking only one question. Are you willing to move with me? For years, Walter had stood on the bank, watching time pass, convincing himself that stillness was peace. But peace, he now knew, wasn't found in retreat. It was found in participation, in showing up, in choosing again and again not to turn away. The cabin lights glowed softly behind him as he stood. He placed a hand against the doorframe, solid, familiar, earned. Tomorrow, there would be more repairs, more conversations, more small, meaningful moments. Not because life demanded them, but because Walter welcomed them. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he had chosen to rebuild. As the camera would slowly pull back over the porch, across the creek, into the quiet forest, the message would linger, unspoken but unmistakable. Sometimes, the thing you stumble upon when you feel most lost isn't just a place. It's a second chance. And sometimes, the life that changes everything isn't a new one at all. It's the one you finally decide to live. Walter Hayes never set out to change his life. He didn't wake up one morning with a bold plan or a dramatic goal. All he did was follow a creek slowly, quietly on a day when the silence felt heavier than usual. And yet, that small decision changed everything. The forgotten cabin didn't give him youth or erase grief. What it gave him was permission to engage again, to speak instead of staying silent, to use his hands, his experience, his presence, to accept that purpose doesn't disappear with age, it simply changes shape. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing for more stories about second chances and quiet strength. Sometimes, one unexpected moment changes everything.